All right, so what we're going to talk about is why is an understanding of military history important in a free society? And that's it as far as words on here. The rest is just going to be images. I won't read. I won't go death by PowerPoint. I won't inflict that upon you. You think about something like this, though, about why is military history important. It's more than, well, you need it to graduate or to pass Mr. Baker's class, in this case. We're talking about in a free society, studying military history, you can't separate it from history. Military history is you can't separate it from the history of us. This is the part of it's the trials, the tribulations of our nation, for better and worse, okay? And we'll talk about that, about some of the impact and the relationship that the military has had within our society. But think about that issue alone. The military reflects our society. Okay, today it's we can trace that arc of it throughout our nation's history. Today it's a professional force, it's a volunteer force. But it reflects who we are across it. And that's not the case in many parts of the world. So you can't separate it from history. We need to also understand the importance of it is it's human history. It's not just an American history part of it. Conflict has been inseparable from who we are even before recorded history. So we need to address that. Look a little bit at the changes in military history over time. We'll talk about that, and you've experienced some of that, even though the new military history is from the 1950s and 60s. I'm not sure how new that is, but it changed. It changed how we think about it. And yet, really, most people don't think about military history in this new way. They think about it as this whiff of gunpowder and a study of battles and a memorization of numbers and leadership of this general or that general. It's more than that. Military history is partly our relationships with each other as well, and we need to talk about that part. But as we start, like I already said this part, it's more than battle history. It's more than infotainment. You think about the United States, you look at these images, which two movies are we talking about here? Apocalypse Now, Robert Duvall, Gee, I Love Young Boy, I Love the Smell of Napalm in the Morning, Saving Private Ryan on the right. I put those two on there because military history traditionally, they've thought about it as this triumphant part of history, as this victory over great odds, and there's elements of that in a Hollywood film. We've discussed that before. Hollywood can help teach history, but it's rare. Okay, that typically isn't the purpose of Hollywood. There is an entertainment aspect to it, but something like a Saving Private Ryan sparked serious scholarship, especially in this new military history that we'll talk about, to look at and examine other parts to those battles, to a World War II in that case. When I said the role of conflict in human history, this is over 5,000 years old. This is the Narmer, it's part of an urn, this stele, this palette. And Narmer was who unified Upper and Lower Egypt, and that's symbolized within this victory palette that they had. He has a mace in one hand, and who they defeated, he has by the hair. He's about to crush his skull. But you look at the other parts of this, and again, it's over 5,000 years old. You still have some of that debate because really, this is some of the first hieroglyphics that we were able to find, some of the oldest. There's still a debate on what is going on within this image. We know of him as a leader. Is this more his ascension to a unified Egypt? Are they specific events, victories over rivals in Libya or Upper Egypt? But that idea that conflict is as old and even older than recorded history is present with something like the Narmer palette. You think of something like the Anabasis, Xenophon's 10,000, the March of 10,000, a story that's taught if you're learning classical Greek as a way to learn a language because it was clearly written. Xenophon was a Greek general He's part of a force of mercenaries, of Greek hoplites that are hired to go overthrow the king in Persia. This inspires later on in Alexander the Great's world conquest. The Greeks rejoice in the exploits. This 10,000 gets betrayed, and they end up marching throughout modern day Syria, Turkey, Iraq, into parts of what is like Georgia, and across the Black Sea to home, and they make it, despite being surrounded and attacked the whole time. Two things with that, when you think about the role, the impact of military history with something like that, okay? Not just that it's a work of literature by this general that was a participant, clearly written, helps us understand specific events. It can be nationalistic in a way. The Greeks were city-states at that point in time, but they all rejoiced and had pride in these exploits, these military exploits. Second part, can the military change and create the formation of states? The United States was formed in part out of the American Revolution, no overthrow. Okay, the 13 colonies being established, but was established not by debate, not by words, but there was bloodshed. And so I go back to that earlier thought when we had Robert Duvall, you had Tom Hanks and everybody else in it. War is horrific, okay? You've got that bloodshed. You have that whiff of gunpowder. But it can serve higher purposes. And you think about the things that we've discussed this year, whether it's the defeat of an Adolf Hitler in Nazi Germany, okay? We just said the establishment of this country. Yes, it is the way, I agree with that, but that it's something that again goes across, even in galaxies far, far away, okay? But you think about the establishment, you think about good old George, okay? This history, I said, it informs us of our trials and tribulations as a society. You think about the events that this has led to, not just the American Revolution, but the American Civil War. You think about all of these diverse roles that the military has served in the United States, whether it's helping with Reconstruction efforts after the American Civil War, putting down insurrections in the South, whether it's the pacification of Native Americans and placing them on the reservations, whether it's jobs like establishing the U.S. Military Academy and training engineers to survey across the United States to help with road construction, a corps of engineers to build levees and dams, whether it's around New Orleans, or whether they're going to send officers to go fight against yellow fever and establish the Panama Canal. Probably should have had a slide about the Oregon Trail and you died of dysentery, but anyway, okay. The U.S. military has been, again, we say that fabric and that part, the core parts that it is within our history. It's inescapable. Should carry this part around here. Civilian control of the military is something that dates back even before the United States, as far as with England. It's a balance. On the one hand, you had a deep fear of a standing military, of a standing army, okay? Then on the other hand, you didn't have this standing army, you didn't dedicate the resources to it, you had a militia, okay, in these communities. This is and then you're gonna have the roots of civilian control of the military, local control through those militias, where the people help pick their leaders. And from it, there's a distrust of those colonial governors. Instead, it's gonna be the legislatures that are gonna control it. And then when the United States is established, put right into the Constitution, you have the executive branch, the president, commander-in-chief. You have Congress with war-making acts and power of the purse, right? Shared checks, balances. This moment, who are the two figures there?
Is that Harry Truman?
That's Harry Truman. That's MacArthur. This is a core moment. It's a key moment in American history. This is shortly after. This is during the Korean War. MacArthur challenging the president as far as what should policy be in Korea. Okay, should the United States go after communist China? Should atomic weapons be used? How far north into North Korea should the United States go and UN forces allied with it? MacArthur was undercutting the civilian leadership of the country. Truman's going to fire him. MacArthur was one of the most popular people in the United States. He did challenge, though, and not just challenge, he disobeyed civilian leadership, civilian oversight. Not just the president, but really the powers that are there. You couldn't have that. As difficult a moment, and look, newspapers are going to be critical of Truman for this firing. MacArthur was a war hero. Okay, but stop and think for a minute. Think about these momentous decisions and who should be in charge of them. There is a balance, right? You want military leaders, whether they're admirals, whether they're generals, to be a part of this process, and should be a part of this process. Who should make policy? Okay? And that's when I'm talking about military history. You need to have leaders that can exercise that policy, but they need to be informed. A decision like going to the Yalu River in North Korea and potentially threatening communist China, or maybe you allow nuclear weapons to be considered to escalate that conflict, maybe leading to World War III. Or to quote the Princess Bride, don't get in a land war in Asia. Okay? Who should make those determinations? You want an elected leader that has a good understanding of history and the events and what can lead and make that policy. But just as importantly, do you need an electorate that's informed to select the right leaders, to provide oversight in case there's abuses? Something like war should not be undertaken lightly. It can't be. Not just the treasure, not just the chaos, the blood. It should be. And the thing is, we've talked about this before in class, is warfare predictable? It's not. There's a Pandora's box element to it. You go in, and our friend Chuck, Carl, and Clausewitz, right? In war, friction, you know what to do. The simplest things. It's never simple to do one, okay? Warfare is complicated. It should be a big decision about not just going into war, but do you escalate it? What are the actions that you take? Are we faced today, close to 70 years, well, we're at the 70th year anniversary of the start of the Korean War. Are we still facing the repercussions of what happened in the early 1950s? Absolutely. This other part, and I've already kind of started talking about it. We as citizens, Americans as citizens, we have an obligation to stay informed. You have an obligation to the men and women in uniform that go and serve. The military doesn't choose to go do those things. Civilian control of the military. So we have an obligation to know the background and what's going to lead them, that it should not be undertaken lightly. Not just them, their families. You think about the impact that these decisions have on their families, okay, their loved ones, the communities they're from. Okay, you think about the idea today that we have the smallest percentage in American history of people in uniform, that there is a growing divide between civilian culture and military culture, that a military way is becoming more and more of a family affair. You're much more likely, overwhelmingly, to be in the military if you had family members that were in the military. You're much more likely if you were in the South or the rural West to go into the military than if you're in any kind of urban area, or especially in the Northeast. Okay? And so then when I said the idea of how the military reflects who we are we in danger of that changing a little bit? Okay? As with this professional force that's getting downsized and is a smaller percentage than really it's been in a long time, is it truly reflecting who we are as a country? And that's not a criticism of the military in that case. That's the United States looking in the mirror too, right? The people. Where are we here with that picture? When we think about the cost, okay, where is that? That's Arlington National Cemetery. 400,000 people buried there. 400,000. Cost of war, but you think about this. Section 60. Okay, Section 60 is, gosh, it's like 16 acres of Arlington. These are where they're burying the most recent people that have died, that have been saved. that have sacrificed, that have given that last full measure. You go to Arlington Cemetery, there are funerals happening. And especially in this area, where you have the families that are grieving now. Okay? And that is a stark reminder of the cost. The cost that often goes on without us thinking about it. Okay? $400,000 the whole cemetery, you've got hundreds of acres, there's 14 for that. When we say that this is who we are, that military history is part of where we are, where we're from. And I said the idea of a new military history. The older, the more traditional military history, the view of it was that battle after battle, campaign after campaign, which I read an awful lot of those. In the 50s and the 60s, there was a shift to looking at other factors that make up military history. Not just the generals, but what about the truck drivers that supply those soldiers in the field that you're not going to have victory without? What about the nurses? What about not just Rosie the Riveter, okay, or people working in shipyards? What about the social impact of war? Not just during a big conflict like World War II, but think about the social impact of Vietnam, with protests, with generational divides. Those things are worthy of study. Think about technological innovation. Okay, and the impact that has, not just on war, we're going to look at an example in a minute, but on society as a whole. Keep that in mind. What event are you looking at here, do you think? And why this is important, again, to look at the background. There's a military historian, a guy named Sir Michael Howard, that talked about the roots of victory and defeat can be found far away from a battlefield. Which battle we talked about that's what this is, and battle is stretching it a little bit. Midway's not a bad thought. Coral Sea's not a bad thought. I'm not seeing any aircraft carriers like directly in this. So. Tonkin Gulf. Tonkin Gulf incident. Roots of war, roots of defeat, roots of victory found far away. Misunderstandings, right? The second attack, really, that now that more and more information is being declassified, as more and more information is brought out for history. Getting into the Vietnam conflict here in 1964, not with a declaration of war, but by Congress acquiescing some of those war powers to the president, trusting that if there's going to be an escalation, the president will go back to Congress. Okay, and that didn't happen. We go deeper and deeper into it. You have a vote of 504-2 in favor of this act that changes the balance of power as far as war making. And going into this conflict slowly, and it becomes a quagmire. You think about an event like that. You think about an event like this. What are you looking at there? The U.S. Embassy seal, the U.S. seal. It's been defaced, right? That one's in Tehran, that's in Iran. That's eventually the hostage, what leads to the hostage crisis, the takeover of the embassy. But stopping and thinking that if the importance of why military, your elected leaders in the electorate, looking at history. You can't look at the Iranian hostage crisis and not look at and try and think about the overthrow of Mossadegh, a democratically elected leader of Iran that was going to nationalize oil. That is a factor back in the 1950s that's going to lead to a movement that's eventually going to overthrow and lead to an Islamic revolution. Looking at something deeper, looking at how these factors are going to lead to a ripple effect down the road, or at least predict it. Look, does history repeat itself? It doesn't. It's not a scientific experiment that way, but does it rhyme? It does rhyme. And you can study it and try to avoid some missteps and predict and lead to better judgment. And that's history in general, but these ones, again, we're focused on military history because, look, are the consequences incredibly severe if you misjudge. It's not just, in the case here, it's not that you lose an election, okay, or that the stock market changes, okay? These are lives. This is the rescue mission, okay, to try to rescue those hostages that fails. Okay, you have the U.S. as a superpower and it was unable to rescue those hostages during 1979. This rescue mission fails. And I think Iran's been in the news recently as well. We'll throw that in there. What are we looking at in these two pictures? When we're thinking again about looking at not just something in a moment, catching up on current events, there's a difference between current events and studying military history and history, right? Do you recognize anything in these two pictures? What's that? Ooh.
It's the Persian Gulf.
Okay, we are in the Persian Gulf region. There is one pretty famous person in that picture.
Bin Laden.
That might be Bin Laden. Okay, Peter Arnett, Peter Bergen. This is the interview in a cave, and essentially in part of Afghanistan, where Osama bin Laden declared war on the United States in 1997. And look, there were people in the government, and in the military, and the intelligence services, some that paid attention to this, but most Americans didn't. Okay, you're gonna have not long after, you're gonna have in 2000 the bombing of the USS Cole, okay, in Yemen, so in the Persian Gulf region, okay, an attack that's linked through what we would call Al-Qaeda. You're gonna have things like the embassy bombings, okay, the embassy bombings in Kenya and Tanzania. All of these factors, not just looking at them one at a time, but looking at the backdrop of the rise in radicals in those regions. Let's stop and think for a minute. There's an emphasis, and rightly so, that when you're at war, you're preparing for war, is there a priority to find people that speak languages that would be useful? To understand culture and traditions? Would we agree that that's useful? Can you make an argument that it's just as useful though, that you study that history and the military history, and again, that new military history, looking at the societies and what's happened to them? If you're gonna go into Afghanistan, should you understand the reactions of Afghanistan, whether it was the Soviet invasion or the British involvement in Afghanistan centuries earlier than that? If you're going into Vietnam, should you understand the Vietnamese reaction to outside intervention, whether they were Chinese, French, or the Mongols? You should, okay? There should be priorities, and you can make an argument that understanding that military history part of it is just as, if not more important, than the culture and the language, understanding those things. Because just because you understand the culture and the language, that doesn't mean that you get the predictability of what's gonna happen down the road. Let's skip over this John Singer Sargent, but that idea of the new military history part of it, that you're bringing in art, social, political, economic. Pluto, okay? When I said the idea of military, what's going on with the military leading to things that will have a longer term impact, this is called Pluto. This is this line that they put underwater, okay, to transport fuel oil. 172 million gallons after the Normandy invasion going to flow across the English Channel to help fuel the advance across northwestern Europe towards Germany to lead to their defeat. Okay, that's not a study of Eisenhower or Montgomery or anybody else. These are these affairs, engineers and others that came up with things that were essential to achieving victory. And look, technological, I mean, using the force clearly is something that is a force multiplier on the battlefield, right? Okay. Harlem Hellfighters, African American unit, World War I. That had been largely ignored. This is part of that new history, okay, where you're looking at other groups, that those stories and their involvement and their importance were not being paid attention to. Opportunities in the workplace during World War II for minorities, and minority women as well. Okay, we talked about that one, right? As far as the 442nd Regimental Combat Team during the war. You know, the idea of a Rosie the Riveter and munitions workers, but also things like the WASPs, okay? The women, the air service pilots. They're gonna fly planes, freeing up male pilots to be at the front in combat, okay? 25,000 women tried out for this, 1,800 were admitted and 1,000 graduated, a little over 1,000. Remarkable. Stories that had not been told started to be told in the 50s and 60s and beyond, and to today. Okay, just had to pick a little bit. Plus, I still, That is a vile substance, V8 juice, but anyway. But rationing, the impact socially, okay, of conflict. Okay, another one, at 4.6 million braceros. Bracero program was this work program. We had work shortages, labor shortages out in the West especially. This kind of short visa program for workers in areas where there was a labor shortage. They had this from 42 until 1964. 4.6 million laborers from Latin America were brought in the United States to do this. And those stories, those contributions, those stories weren't told. They just this year, just a few months ago, put up a statue in LA to the Braceros, like this 20-foot statue of a Bracero and his family. And approaching the end of some of this, what are you looking at here? Pretty flowers, right? Okay, this is in Margraten, this is in the Netherlands. Margraten is the Netherlands American Cemetery. Okay, it's a place where Dutch, this is at the end of World War II. The Dutch were occupied, had been brutalized by the Nazis for years. They'd been taken over in the spring of 1940. They're liberated in the late fall and winter of 44 going into 45. And at this place that eventually becomes the Netherlands American Cemetery, it was orchards, fruit orchards. It was ravaged by battle. And you're gonna have 17,000+ American graves that are gonna be there, this cost of war. And the Dutch families, that first Memorial Day, covering Margraten, covering this temporary cemetery that didn't have the nice stone and everything at that point in time, with a quilt of flowers. 60 villages, they gathered their flowers and sent them to this American cemetery for Memorial Day to honor those that fell liberating their homeland. And today, Dutch families and some German and businesses and schools take care of these graves as if they're their own families. On the soldier's birthday, on religious holidays, okay, on Memorial Day, they go clean the grave and decorate it still with flowers and flags, recognizing that sacrifice. The idea of these ghost ships, this is the Joseph Conway, that's gonna be, 30,000 Belgian citizens see it off, carrying 5,000+ American coffins, American soldiers in those coffins, going home to their families. Okay, except for that crew, nobody else alive on that ship. And taking them home to places to be unloaded, whether it's in Brooklyn or others, and then start spreading out across the United States. To places like this small town in southwest Missouri where Henry Wright was waiting. He was a widower, and his 3 sons had gone to war. Okay, his 3 sons had gone to war, and one by one, they're brought home to his farmhouse, unloaded off the train. Neighbors helped bring the coffins to the home. They put those soldiers, those 3 fallen boys, into their bedrooms. They had covered the floors with rose petals, and they stayed up all night watching the bodies. Okay, and then they buried them in the cemetery near the farm that next day. When we're talking about human cost, now did they fight for a cause that helped humanity? Absolutely. Is it something that's interwoven in the fabric of our nation? Absolutely. Is it a cost that should not be undertaken lightly? Absolutely. Okay. You don't want to have those things like the Wright family forgotten. Okay. Thank you for your attention. Baby Yoda thanks you as well. So, all right. Thank you. All right. Oh, you know what? I did want to say thank you. Thank you. Go out and read a military history book on occasion. Talk to a veteran. Talk to their family. Contact and talk to your officials. Know what people are voting on. Because ultimately, if you disagree with a policy, you've got to look in the mirror yourself too. Okay? You're part of the checks and balances. Especially this group. Some of you just registered to vote. The rest of us should register to vote if we haven't already. Okay, so this time I really mean thank you. All right, we'll see you.
Welcome back, viewers. I'm with Mr. Baker, and we're in our Q&A section right now after watching his presentation. And we're just going to start off real quick here and say, Mr. Baker, your degree is in what area of study and where?
Okay, my bachelor's degree is in history from Michigan State University. I have a master's degree in military history from Norwich University.
Okay. Was there an area of focus in your master's, such as a time period or an event?
As far as time period, I specialized in 20th century, but especially the Second World War. And my area of focus would have been the German-Soviet front in that war, specifically the German invasion, Operation Barbarossa,
Okay.
of the Soviet Union in 1941.
Okay. I want to jump into this one now. Some of my questions, you and I have been spending quite a bit of time together talking, and I know that some of my questions get a little long-winded, so you understand that, but I'm hoping our viewers will bear with me as I jump into these long-winded questions. One idea in your presentation, as I understood it, is that the study of military history should help those in power to make informed decisions in regard to the use of force to achieve a goal with the least damage and casualty to the state and those that are in the conflict, and those that we are in the conflict with. Do you see this in practice when running counter to this idea is our involvement in a protracted conflict in Afghanistan for 19 years that Russia got out of after 9?
Okay, I guess there's a couple things that come to mind when you have that question or questions. In there. I would argue, and I don't think it's really a radical thought, that history and military history, which you can't really separate the two, it gives you a broader understanding of events, and it helps lead and strengthen kind of your critical judgment and what to do. So again, history doesn't repeat itself, but you can learn from history and help you make better decisions down the road. The Soviet involvement in Afghanistan is different than U.S. involvement in Afghanistan. So while they're both long wars, protracted wars, asymmetrical wars where one side is stronger and has more force than the other, they're not apples to apples. But I think with any conflict, you have to think about, again, you don't go into it lightly. Warfare has very real consequences for those involved, not just the individuals, but societies as well. So you have to think about, what do you hope to achieve?
Right.
And that's why something like, again, this idea of the forever wars that we're seeing, whether it's in Afghanistan or the Middle East, stopping to think about what, realistically before the conflict starts, what do you hope to achieve? Is it to go after Al-Qaeda after 9/11? Is it to go after the Taliban, giving them shelter? Is it to make a world safer for the United States and others, that these groups, these terror groups, these non-state groups, that they can thrive on? Are you going to go after and try to eradicate those circumstances? You have to have real clear eyes. And that's part of the difficulty right now with Afghanistan. A lot of people do want the United States to pull out, but what's that going to mean at this point in time? With not just all of these lives that have been forever changed or lost, but what's going to happen with that vacuum once the United States leaves.
Right.
That's, that's that idea. You kind of know what you want to do, but how do you do it? It's difficult. So I don't know if that's an answer, but
well, one of the things you brought up, and it made me think here for just a second too. Kind of another question is, is this going to end up being a multi-generational war? This would be the first one in our country. Right? Where we've seen maybe a father and then a son go into the same conflict.
Well, realistically, we already have had that.
Okay.
We already had that in Afghanistan. That's happened.
Okay.
Yep. We've had fathers and sons and daughters as well. We need to remember too with that. I guess you think about the Cold War. The Cold War was not a hot war between the United States and the Soviet Union, but that was something that was multiple generations. 9/11 was 2001.
Yeah, I know.
And we're in 2020 at this point, and so, and frankly, we keep seeing light at the end of the tunnel, but what is that light?
The tunnel gets longer.
Yeah.
Okay, good enough. Congress has the exclusive power to declare war, but in a practical sense, with the deployment of troops specifically in the Eastern Hemisphere, they have deferred to the president. Do you see Congress regaining control of troop deployment in the near future?
That's something that you go back to the United States with our Constitution, dividing up military responsibilities between the branches. That's part of the checks and balances, Congress and the executive. The president being the commander-in-chief, Congress having those war-making, whether it's declaration of war or power of the purse, financing it, that kind of thing. This has been a long-term struggle. It's gotten more of a struggle between these two branches, with the 20th century, with our modern presidents. And as warfare has become, I don't want to say more modern, but in that idea, it's become more complicated in a way. Think about drone strikes as an example, with countries that you don't have a declaration of war, but there may be terrorist targets, that's the kind of thing, enemies of the United States that you're going after, where you have to act quickly.
Right.
Who's going to make that decision?
Right.
What's Congress's role? How well defined? Do either the legislative branches or the executive branches really want the Supreme Court getting involved in it and having a clear definition?
Right.
Kind of clearing up those waters. I think that when you're asking, do I see Congress regaining? I think part of this is not just a congressional responsibility. This is our responsibility too as citizens to take not just those that are impacted directly, military members, their families, community members in that way. But it's your military reflects your society and its values. Congress has kind of punted on this issue and has allowed a lot of power to swing over to the presidency. It is going to be, look at the controversy right now over what to do with Iran, as far as the strike that happened with Suleiman there. We as citizens have to be more involved in this process. We need to hold our elected leaders' feet to the fire a little bit and ask them to be involved in these kinds of issues. I think we're having some of these discussions which are overdue.
Right.
But even in the few weeks since that strike in Iran, we're now moving on to other things.
Well,
That
we got
conversation,
viruses now.
we have that and impeachment proceedings and everything else. But we sometimes only pay attention when there's a crisis. And
Well,
it's
right.
too late if you keep waiting on an issue along those lines.
Right, and I think, in conversations we've had before, it's or off camera, is that nobody's really being affected. So why would we get involved so much? Because we're not really being affected. We don't have shortages. Oil is still flowing.
So when you're saying not being affected, like our everyday, our day-to-day
our
lives
day-to-day,
are not being,
our lives are
and
just not affected.
and that's where I guess that's what I guess I would be urging and saying, is that this is too important not to be affected. That we should as a society take more interest, because ultimately our society's sons and daughters are being put into harm's way. The consequences if something broadens and gets more serious and intense, that's going to have long-term ramifications too. But I don't think there's any question. We're not being forced. There's no ouch factor for the general public.
Right.
We don't pay for it. Our budget, our deficit continues to rise. We're not paying for these things. We don't have any war bond drives or
right.
Liberty Gardens.
That was another
or
thing too.
whatever,
Our economy's fiat, so it's not backed by anything. So you just spend the money.
So, so I guess, I think that we need to, as a society, we need to look beyond what simply affects us day to day.
Right.
And so until we do that, then a few people will be making decisions that put people into harm's way.
Right. So if I guess we kind of covered this other question then right here in this in what you said. Let me jump down here to I am intrigued by the statement you made in your presentation that some regions of the country are represented in greater numbers than other regions. Can you give a subjective explanation on what's causing this, or an objective one?
I guess the objective one is that, you can look at the demographics of where people that serve, that sign up to be in the military, where they come from. And there are, so objectively you can look at that and see. So it's not just about numbers, it's about proportion. So states like California and New York have some of the biggest numbers of people that go into the military, but they have large populations. They should. But if you look at percentages, that changes. They would both be underrepresented. You know, if you live in a more rural community versus an urban community, the numbers are higher, percentage proportion-wise, for who joins. You know, the reality is in our nation's history, we've never had this small of a percentage of people that are in uniform. It's roughly 0.5% of our population. So that means
is it when you say that, in the past, was it, well, I know obviously in the past we had the draft, but you were in and you were out. You know, you served your time and you got out. Now you have people that have made it a profession.
It's an all-volunteer force, and that's changed the nature of the force.
Right.
Yeah, and it's made it, you know, the other part, this is, I guess, more of the subjective, even though I guess I would argue it's an objective one too. It has become kind of a military family affair. You are much more likely to be a member of the military if you have a family member that is or has been a member of the military. That idea that you're talking about, the father, son, or daughter going into the service, that's a reality. But the difference is that, you know, and I guess in the talk I wanted to highlight this kind of divide that's going on between civilians and the military. That's part of this. Is it's not an in and an out or for a few years. The burden is extreme. It's year after year after year. It's decade after decade. And so the burden is heavier on those people. And that heightens this divide, this not understanding where each other is coming from.
Right.
And you know, military members not necessarily understanding the civilian sector kind of a thing, and then the flip side. And then having to adjust when they're coming in to, you know, once they retire or leave service. And the flip side is civilians not having any idea. The idea of, you know, I support the troops or thank you for your service, but stopping to think about what does that mean?
Right.
And how can you thank them for their service? And what do they do? You know, that, you know, they've done studies and surveys along those lines, just that high percentage that says we support the military, but, well, what does the military do? And not being able to answer that question.
Do you have any, you might not have any idea on this, but because you're saying it's 0.5% are in the military overall of the population, is that number going down?
Our troop strength, yeah, I mean, yeah, the percentage would go down. The number we've had troop kind of drawdowns over time, which is
no, I mean not in a conflict. I mean just the number of people in uniform.
That's what I'm saying. Is like post Cold War, our military has continued to shrink. You had a slight spike that happened after 9/11, but still not a huge one.
So there must be, even if it's a family affair, you can even see it's kind of splintering off, and you're not getting people who haven't been in the military family joining at this point, maybe.
Yeah, but I mean, but part of it is we just do have a smaller military, so that, you know, and the population continues to grow. You know, if that makes sense.
Okay, so you're saying that, yeah, right.
So,
as it could be the same number, but the population as a percentage. Okay,
yeah,
I see.
So
what
that's
you're
what
saying.
that's what I'm saying there.
I gotcha. This one's pretty long-winded here again. I want to get into some pretty good detail to make my point. A tenet of battle is to be on and fight from the high ground. Since Sputnik, the argument can be made that space is the ultimate high ground, where we have military assets like satellites and Air Force's mysterious X-37B space plane. America now has a sixth branch of the military, Space Force, whose duties are to protect the interests of the United States in space, deter aggression in, from, and to space, and conduct space operations. In land battles, there are examples where troops have taken the high ground from opposing forces only to have it taken back by those same forces. Hamburger Hill kind of comes to mind. It's kind of a back and forth. I can't see in space where a back and forth could happen. The battle for space would be so definitive and the assets destroyed couldn't be readily replaced that the winner of the conflict would control and have a substantial, maybe insurmountable advantage in any battle taking place on the planet's surface. What do you think about that?
I think a couple things. I don't necessarily, well, I guess let me back up. That's part of with this. Space is going to play a role in any kind of a upcoming conflict. Whether or not it's a scene of warfare, it's being used. I mean, our military depends heavily on space capacity, whether it's satellites and others for navigation or whatever it might be. Intelligence, that kind of thing, we depend on it. It provides a pretty serious technical edge for U.S. military forces, for decision making, whatever it might be. So it's already playing a role. If there's some kind of a great power war, which we really haven't had for quite a while, not just with the U.S. involved, but with others, large states really getting into big wars with each other, powerful, wealthy kind of states. But if we have one of those again, space will definitely be a scene of fighting. I think everybody knows this. I have to assume there's preparations for it. Satellites being replaced, having a redundancy in systems, depending on cheaper, smaller replacements that can be up in orbit shorter periods of time or whatever it might be.
Which we are seeing that now.
So I think there's going to be some of that. But the problem to me is the United States depends more than any country on these things. And it's not just about the military, it's about commerce. I mean, as far as our economic, we depend on these satellites. Any kind of a denial, even if it's short term, is losing an edge.
I could just see, in the end that everybody's blowing up each other's stuff, and we just have space junk everywhere. And if we survive the war, we're not ever going back to the moon, because I don't think we're getting past it. We're getting past the stuff, and how are you ever even going to get anything back up there? Because it's just going to get pounded by the junk.
Well, there's thousands.
It's unfortunate.
Well, I think it's a thing.
It's kind of how we treat our oceans. Treat space the same way.
I don't even think there's a certain amount of truth to that. There is a what's expedient to do.
There just isn't whales up there eating the space junk, like they do with the plastic. But
you have thousands of satellites that are not even functioning anymore, and other pieces of space debris.
That were coming down, just almost going to run into each other the other day.
So we definitely have that issue. I think you're right. There's going to have to be that's going to have to be addressed. At some point, it's who's going to do it, and because there's too many uncertainties. How do you track this stuff?
I think they're having a hard time now.
Yeah, they are, and so at some point. But I agree that you're going to have whether it's firing from space, firing from Earth. You're going to have these things targeted that are out there. I do think you'll be able to reclaim that high ground that you're talking about, but it's not it may not be as quick. But again, I mean that's the thing. If the U.S. military forces short term went blind, that could be that would take and erode a critical edge that the United States has.
Right.
And that could be decisive.
Because we control the air half the time. All your AWACS and everything's blind.
So I think that now there are people that plan and work on this stuff. This is not like some kind of that this is suddenly the scales coming back from the eyes and seeing this all of a sudden. People have been seeing this coming. But the United States is vulnerable, probably more vulnerable than other countries because we depend on it so much. So I think the high ground, to your question, I think it can be reclaimed. I think this is why there is a space force being created. That kind of an idea. The United States is not the only country. Now, maybe they have different camouflage uniforms.
Well, maybe they'll have a janitorial crew, right?
To clean up a little bit the mess that's up there.
Right. Well, I appreciate the time. I really enjoyed it, and I think people will enjoy the presentation. So I appreciate it, and thanks.
Okay. Thanks, Tim.
Bye.